14 hours in, and I probably haven't progressed as far as or learned as much as others. And despite an initial experience that ranged from, this is wonderful, to, it's 2018, are they serious with this? It's apparent now that it was only a matter of time before I would fall into what feels like an intricately woven and never-ending web of charm and spectacular presentation. This is my tale as a hunter who's just embarked on his first proper monster-slaying adventure. I could talk for days about my previous attempts to indulge in the worlds of Monster Hunter, but to put it simply, the game, no matter how exciting its concepts may have seemed, was just never going to click with me due to its almost entirely handheld existence. The small screen experience merely enhanced the many difficulties that lie within learning Monster Hunter, and if I'm being honest, I was never a fan of the game's aesthetic or graphical presentation there. I had a lot of personal barriers for entry in place that I never attempted to overcome. So when I heard Monster Hunter was coming proper to console and PC, I was ecstatic to give the franchise yet another go, and my time with the beta demonstrated just how effective this transition to the big screen would be in erasing many of, if not all of, my personal barriers for entry. I walked away excited, but still feeling like this would be a game about killing monsters over and over again and not much else. My time with the full release has revealed that Monster Hunter World is, as you would expect, absolutely a game about killing monsters again and again. But it's the delivery of that concept and the execution of everything else the game does that ensures it's quite a bit more than just a boss fight simulator. Let me start a bit out of order here and talk about my experience with combat, because not only is it integral to the gameplay loop of World, it's also the number one area in which most new players seem to struggle. A lot of the early remarks I've seen revolve around the combat feeling clunky, slow, sluggish, or not having any flow. Now, out of the 14 weapons in the game, some are obviously going to be slower than others by design, but even with something like the mighty Greatsword, I've found there is indeed flow to be found. Monster Hunter just makes you work a bit more for it than your typical action RPG, and for me, that's a huge part of the charm and satisfaction behind combat. I love how the Greatsword, even for my character as an A-lister, badass monster hunter extraordinaire, is still a massive freaking sword. It's like swinging around bits and pieces of a motorcycle on the end of a telephone pole. It takes tremendous effort to execute even a single attack, and the game represents that spectacularly well. It does that, in fact, with all of the game's weapons. There's a supreme amount of demonstration for the power and handling of each and every weapon on the list through the game's beautiful animations. It's a system that reminds me a lot of The Witcher 3's combat, in that it looks as good as you make it look. There is a decently balanced learning curve here with most of these weapons, and I can see why folks find themselves frustrated with it. It is a system that makes you feel like rubbish when you're starting off, and you're pretty much guaranteed to be punished for your mistakes as you're learning by monster attacks for probably the first hour or so. But once you start to connect and link combos and understand how certain ammo or arrow coding types work, the game will reward you with powerful attacks that are as spectacular to watch and experience as they are in raw damage numbers. Throw in that player choice and replayability that comes from having those 14 diverse weapon types, and the combat of Monster Hunter is something I simply can't get enough of now that I've invested some serious time into it. While we're on the subject of animations and combat presentation, let's talk about just how well this entire frickin' game, the experience that is Monster Hunter World, is presented to the player. Because while I was initially stumbling my way through combat with the Greatsword and walking into Astera for the first time, it was all of the little details that grabbed my attention, made me grin, and kept me hooked, pushing to learn more and better understand World's myriad of systems and gameplay mechanics. You know, I see a lot of people cracking jokes about the Palico and their weebness, but honestly, I've never been one to discriminate against anime, and I will be damned if these little furry slaves, they are definitely slaves, unfortunately, aren't one of the best bits of the game. I honestly lost it in the opening cutscenes when my character decided some handler he just met was more important than this cat repping leather armor like a boss who probably just pledged his service for life, and my dude's just gonna let him fall into the fiery abyss like that? Fortunately, the little guy comes out unscathed, and as the game begins to deliver its cutscenes and story elements, I found myself invested and interested in the larger world of Monster Hunter on display here. I mean, yeah, it's not the most breathtaking or original story, it's not gonna win any awards, but it doesn't need to, and it feels like something out of my childhood in all the best ways. It's like remembering how amazing Power Rangers was as a kid, and going back to rewatch it as an adult, but instead of seeing its flaws exposed as your now jaded 28-year-old self, you can actually rewatch it just as it was when you were 8 years old. The whole thing is just really well delivered, and I find myself genuinely digging the lively nature of the game's many characters, especially the Muscular Chef. His cooking crew and his obsession with gains. The whole idea of a pre-hunt meal, much like a pre-workout for weightlifting, is hilarious, absurd, and spectacular, all bundled up into one big ball of that made me smile. Now, the main hub itself is just a wonderfully detailed place, with locations like the canteen, all really fleshed out and alive, filled with NPCs going about their business, many of which are tied to certain systems within the game, and some of which are just there, walking about. You can interact with them. Maybe occasionally that A-lister at that table will give you a quest that you didn't think he would ever give you. It's just a really well-designed location. And once you head out into the open worlds of Monster Hunter, you realize that they exist as more than just places on a map. They're actually their own ecosystems filled with large monsters, small monsters, creatures, insects, even freaking ants. They all play their role in that great circle of life. And the design and details of these environments ensure there's plenty to explore and discover, each location filled with caverns, swamps, forests, mud pits, things to climb on, push through, swim in, fish from, and swing on. The devs have managed to squeeze so much out of spaces that are actually quite small, especially when compared to most of the open worlds we see in gaming today. Each location, despite its size, manages to function as a full-blown adventure. It's really no wonder I've spent more time just mucking about in expeditions than I have in actual quests. Consequently, and likely by design, this level of detail in the world building of World makes for a game that easily removes the concept of the grind from its vocabulary. Yes, World, like any game, includes repetition, but that's because hunting monsters is what you do and therefore you do it more than once. But it is a game that reminds me just how often we misuse that term grind. I really don't think it applies here. Yeah, you might head on out and hunt down 3 Jagras just to build that armor or that sword, but hunting a Jagras, even as a skilled hunter, is still an enjoyable piece of the gameplay loop. Not to mention, the game's progression system ensures you'll be moving on before you know it to the next bigger and badder monster, once again faced with the process of learning attack patterns, behaviors, and abilities to actually survive and defeat it. World also goes above and beyond and does a lot of very smart things when it comes to handling those repetitive elements. Research bounties are linked to earning upgrade points for armor, which give players a direct reward for completing additional goals while on hunts and expeditions. Investigations remove the need to just replay main quests to fight certain monsters, and instead give the player more challenging hunts, captures, and objectives by putting new restrictions or difficulty modifiers in place. Resource gathering is integral to crafting and hunt preparation and success, while being deep enough to exist as its own freaking game. The whole thing, interestingly enough, when it comes together, plays out like you're an actual monster hunter. It's funny to say that, and I know it comes across as obvious, but it's not often that games are based around a concept as fantastical as hunting giant monsters while managing to create what is essentially a simulation environment for said concept. If Monster Hunter was a real-life venture or occupation, Monster Hunter World would be the DCS of monster hunting video games. So how about those monsters? The really big ones with names that I can sometimes barely pronounce.
That is not good. What are you waiting for? Get over here!
Well, they are utterly fantastic, and I honestly think some of the greatest digital creations of our time when it comes to video games. I really do mean that. Everyone and anyone who worked on bringing these things to life needs to take a bow, because you've done something special here. While the experience revolves around murdering endless hordes of these monsters, you've still managed to create beings with their own full-blown personalities. They are far more than their physical appearance. They have their own voice, their own movement and attack patterns. They each deal with injury in their own ways. They exist in their own biomes and locations, and they even have their own enemies among the other monsters, some who exist as their predators or even their prey. Tracking these monsters while climbing through vines and wading through neck-deep water is core to the Monster Hunter experience, but it's that experience that is further brought to life by the life these monsters have been given. It even manages to make me feel kinda awful at times about killing them, and that's no doubt just another part of Monster Hunter World's charm.
As I look to my future with Monster Hunter World, it's clear that this is a game I'm going to be playing for a long time to come. Not just because the development team is going to be adding a lot more content along the way, but because there's still so much more for me to learn and do. I really have barely scratched the surface at 14 hours. There are still so many things I don't understand, so many weapons I haven't experimented with, and I'm just now reaching that point where I'm realizing how deep crafting actually is and how much time I can spend out on expeditions just looking for perish rooms so I can make trank bombs, so I can actually capture a monster alive. I've barely begun to understand all of the details behind using the greatsword. I haven't even made use of the block or the shoulder charge to counter monster attacks yet. There's just so much here. When I talked about Monster Hunter being a monster hunting simulation, this is exactly what I was hitting on, and it makes me very excited for my future with this game. It's the type of experience much like DCS, much like other sim games I've played in the past, where I can just kind of hunker down on a weekend, spend 3 or 4 hours just out learning 1 or 2 mechanics, and there's an exceptional amount of enjoyment and satisfaction behind that. If there was one thing I'd like to say to everyone out there sitting on the fence about Monster Hunter, it's that this is probably one of the best games out right now for you to take a risk on. Not only has the development team been fantastic with the way in which they've presented the game to us as a base model, but there's going to be free DLC in the future. The only microtransactions they're really utilizing are additional hairs and emotes that you just buy straight out. No loot crates here. This is a game with a lot of content, a lot of meat, and all of it extremely well executed. If you had any interest in this game, and if this video has further sparked your interest, I would say that Monster Hunter is well worth dropping the $60+ on and taking a chance on what could potentially become one of your all-time favorite games. I know it's going to be up there on the list with me because it's already grown on me so much, it can only grow on me more from here.